screen. Okay. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted that you invited me to talk about social resilience in fisheries. This is a topic I've been interested in and working on for about 20 years. And so I'm aware that you've had 2 sessions already on economic and environmental resilience. So today, really, I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the ways of thinking and conceptualizing the social dimension of resilience. But more than that, I want to share with you 2 stories that have really stuck with me about and made me think that resilience can be a useful concept to work with in terms of understanding what's happening to people in fisheries and how they are able or unable to respond to environmental change. But also, I'm quite critical of resilience as being a panacea that we should all be aiming for. And actually, I think there's some critical questions to also ask about what are the implications of being resilient if you are in a fishing family on things like your well-being. And I want to share that idea with you today in the hope that it's useful to some of the work that you're all doing. So let's start with some concepts of resilience and where social resilience fits within that. I'm sure you're all very much aware already the capacity to recover quickly from a particular shock or stress. We often talk about resilience at a system level, so looking at it from a combined environmental and social angle and looking at the interactions between people and the environment within what we call a social ecological system. And I think that's a very useful idea as well, and how that system itself, whether it be at the entire fishery level, is able to maintain its basic structure and function, despite some of the stresses that may be upon it. We also talk about resilience as a sense of bouncing back, and some of the recent work that I've read goes further than that. For example, Joseph and McGregor in their latest book say it should be about bouncing back better. So not just returning to some point of stability, but actually improving on where the system originally was. And I really like that idea, and I think it bridges nicely with ideas of social development and progress. Okay, so when we're talking about social resilience specifically, really what we're thinking about is how the idea of resilience manifests itself at the individual level, within a household and a family, and also within a wider community, and also at an institutional level. So how do the rules and ways of being and living together, how do they shape how people are able to exhibit resilience in their day-to-day lives? So there's a lot of work on the social aspects of resilience, so understanding the factors that allow communities to deal with shocks. A lot of work has been done in the context of disasters research, so looking at shocks such as flooding, for example. But I really like this definition from Chris Benney, who I'm sure many of you are aware of his work. He's written a lot about fisheries, and he describes social forms of resilience as any type of capacity and skill, action, strategy, investment, and anticipation, which helps to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from a particular shock. Okay, so let me start with my first story. So 20 years ago, I was a PhD student in India, working in a place called Pulicat Lake, which is India's 2nd largest lagoon, a very important fishery. There's 52 fishing villages around the lake shore. And I lived there for nearly 2 years, studying the ways that those fishers lived and how they managed their fishery. And this is where I was first introduced to the theory of resilience, because it wasn't originally part of my thesis, but I found it as an extremely useful set of ideas that helped me explain what I could see happening. And basically what happened in that fishery, it was a very valuable prawn stake net fishery in the lagoon. And there were very powerful villages of a particular high caste or a traditional fishing caste called Patanava. And they dominated the entire fishery and they benefited the most. They had the best fishing spots. They had the most wealth. They had great catches. They had a lot of social status, built huge temples, had very flamboyant festivals, had a very significant higher social status compared with other villages who are not of that fishing caste. And in particular, I looked at some of the dialect villages or the scheduled caste villages there who have historically been very disadvantaged in India. But these villages had very little access to the prawn fishery, and they were always campaigning to get better fishing rights. And they had significantly less wealth, less fishing gears. They fished using the handheld nets, so very basic fishing gears. And I started to see some interesting comparatives between these two groups of people around the lake. And when I looked at the lagoon through a resilience lens, as many of you will know, lagoons are highly dynamic environments. They're very seasonal. This particular lagoon was very dependent upon freshwater input from rains. And when it didn't rain, or when the rains failed, the lagoon became extremely saline. And this caused quite a regular collapse in the entire fishery. And I did a lot of historical work with the fishes, and they call these years as black years. And we kind of plotted back over about a 50-year period where people could remember periods of famine in the lagoon when the fishery collapsed. Everybody migrated out and left the lagoon. And I started to look at how these different groups of people were dealing with these lean fishing periods, and when the lagoon became very salty and very hot because of a lack of rain. And to my surprise, what my research found was that actually these poorer scheduled caste fishing villages who were less wealthy in economic terms were actually demonstrating far greater forms of resilience. They had much more diverse livelihood portfolios. They were better at saving money. They used to criticize these wealthier villages for being frivolous with their money, spending it all on these lavish festivals. They would say, we're better at saving, so we've got something to see us through these lean periods. And they were very active campaigners. So in some ways, they were more resilient to fishery collapse, despite being less wealthy. And this idea really made me start to think about, well, how do what people are pursuing in terms of what's important to them, in terms of their own well-being, how does this sometimes complement or frustrate their capacities to be resilient? And in this case, and this was a common saying there, that a man will leave his wife, but never his padu, his fishing spot. The Patanava fishers, despite being wealthier when the fishery was going well, they were very attached to their way of fishing. And they were locked in to an overly specialized, lucrative, but unstable fishery. And so they were vulnerable to lean fishing periods. So I've asked this question about this possible tension between how people pursue their lives in a way that they feel is meaningful to them. How do they pursue their well-being? And how does that sit alongside being resilient? And so another piece of work I did later on was working with a PhD student of mine, Yuski Britton, in Northern Ireland. And she spent a lot of time talking to fishers, trying to find out how they were adapting to diminishing returns, economic returns from declining fish catch. And she found that there were two key modifications of fishing behavior. The first was reducing crew size to try and reduce costs. Sometimes people would go fishing completely alone, which they knew was a dangerous thing to do. So they were trading off their safety at sea with increased take-home pay. The other thing they did was that they spend more time at sea because they're trying to get a greater catch. And this had a massive impact on the quality of life of those fishers, especially in terms of their relationships with their family, who were having to spend longer periods of time at home alone. And there's lots of quotes in this article about the impacts of that on quality of life, of spending longer times at sea. And this led us to write a bit more about the impacts in particular on relationships between husbands and wives, men and women within the fishing household, and how sometimes building resilience in terms of economic resilience to be able to get more fish and better take-home pay can sometimes erode parts of our social resilience, our relationships with others with whom we live. And there's a lot of work about this, in particular on the impacts of women, fisher wives around the world, who are often known in Northern Ireland as grass widows for the long periods of time they have to spend at home, keeping the whole household running whilst their husbands are at sea. And we write a little bit here about the impacts on their well-being, their sense of isolation, and the many things that they have to do, often lots of different sorts of work, as well as childcare, having very little time for themselves. So what is the relevance of this for fisheries management? I would say, in terms of your work and your discussions later, what opportunities exist to strengthen both resilience and well-being outcomes? So thinking about some of these tensions and trying to think about opportunities to make them complement each other. What is the interplay, the interactions between the environmental, the economic, and the social resilience? How can we achieve a more multidimensional insight into the types of strategies that fishing households are adopting? What are some of the trade-offs? Or another way of thinking about trade-offs is simply hard choices that people are having to make in how they adapt their behavior to cope with the pressures within fisheries. And how could fisheries management help soften some of these hard choices? For example, support to help strengthen important relationships that can influence resilience, such as families. Okay, and I think I'm going to stop there. I hope I kept within time, but please, if anybody has any further questions about this or would like some of the articles,
you kept very well with the time, Sarah. Thank you very much. And I think it was a very, very interesting presentation for all of us, which gave us some insight into the kind of work that you are doing as a researcher in social marine